If you are pregnant or you've recently had a baby, this podcast is for you. I am your host, Kath Bequee, a physiotherapist working in women's health and mum of three. Inside my online program, Fitness Mama, I just love helping support women to care for their bodies during pregnancy, prepare their bodies for birth, and support their after-birth recovery, helping them feel confident and strong inside out during this important stage of their lives. In this podcast, join me each week as we dive into all things pregnancy care, childbirth, and postnatal recovery, helping you through every step of the journey. It is absolutely possible to feel amazing and confident in our bodies during this motherhood journey, and I want that for you. Come and say hi to me on Instagram at FitnessMama, and let's dive into today's episode. Hello and welcome back to the Pregnancy, Birth and Recovery podcast. So today's episode is all about pregnancy and postpartum and thyroid issues. So discussing today everything from Hashimotos, postpartum thyroiditis, we're discussing pregnancy thyroid issues, we're talking about treatment options in terms of both conventional and natural therapy options, we're discussing why thyroid issues potentially become more prevalent during pregnancy, supplements, foods, the whole works. So if you've got thyroid issues, this podcast episode is perfect for you. Or if you know someone who's got issues during pregnancy and postpartum, send them this podcast episode, because I'm chatting with Shelley McKenzie, and Shelley's been in the health industry for over 15 years. She is a mum to 3 kids and the founder of Freedom Wellness. It's a wellness hub specializing in women's health where Shelley practices as a clinical nutritionist and naturopath. So Shelley's journey began when she was 24 years old, and she experienced a sudden health storm within her body. So she was diagnosed with a condition called Hashimotos, an autoimmune disease. And from here, she made it her mission to learn about nutrition and how she can overcome and manage this diagnosis by using the food is medicine principles. And she now pairs her degrees with her own personal health experiences to help her clients live a healthy, happy, and well-balanced life. So you're going to love this episode. Or if you know someone with thyroid issues, please do send them this episode, because I trust it's going to be really helpful. Before I do dive into this episode, I'd love to invite you to come and join our free 7-day trial. If you need support to exercise during pregnancy, if you need support with pelvic girdle pain, preparing your body for birth, preparing your pelvic floor for birth, or if you need support with your postpartum recovery and your postnatal rehab and getting back into running and getting strong again after giving birth, then Fitness Mama would be perfect for you. So join us for a free 7-day trial at fitnessmama.com, and all the links are in the show notes. Right, let's dive into this episode today with Shelley. Shelley, thank you so much for joining me today on the Pregnancy, Birth and Recovery podcast. I'm really excited to chat about all things pregnancy and thyroid.
Me too. Thanks for having me again, Catherine. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so we're just working out when you last chatted on the podcast. It was a couple of years ago now, and that was quick tips for postpartum nutrition. So this is perfect. We're now diving onto the other side of the spectrum and discussing, well, I'm sure we'll talk about postpartum, but discussing pregnancy issues with thyroid. So amazing. I don't know much about this topic, so I feel a little bit ignorant. So I'm going to learn a lot too, no doubt.
Well, that's what I'm here for. And I guess, I became very familiar with the thyroid because I myself have Hashimotos, which is one of the most common thyroid disorders. And so that really threw me into learning about Hashimotos, both from a practitioner point of view, but also personally and how to manage it. So I am very excited to chat all things thyroid, and I can't wait for you to learn a little bit about it as well.
So with the Hashimotos, when did that get diagnosed?
So I was diagnosed when I was 24 years old. So showing my age, that was 13 years ago now. And back then, So I probably had symptoms for quite a while. And so my symptoms were so often a symptom, sorry, is weight gain or weight fluctuations. I didn't have that. However, I had extreme fatigue. I had digestive issues, so a lot of constipation always. And I had hair falling out, and they were kind of, and always cold. Like I am always ridiculously cold, even in summer. Like my husband laughs because I sleep with 2 doonas and socks on in the middle of summer. So they were kind of my symptoms. But when I was 24, I'd moved to Melbourne at 18 from the country, was living, my best partying gal life. I was a personal trainer at the time. So I always say Monday to Friday, I was exercising and eating what I thought was well. But on the weekends, I really was trashing my body, never any recreational drugs, but I was definitely binge drinking, and I was doing the Macca's run at 3 a.m. I wasn't sleeping, and I was just kind of in that cycle from the age of 18 to 24 when my body eventually pulled me up. And so these symptoms were probably going on for quite a while, and I just continued to ignore them until one day I was at that time working for a fitness company as a sales rep, and I was heading to the country to where my parents were still living, and I pulled over on the side of the road and I rang my mum and I said, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it home. I am so ridiculously fatigued and exhausted, and I just felt so nauseous and sick. And she said, pull over, have a nap. If you wake up and you can't get home, just let us know and Dad and I will come and get you. And I was like 2 hours away from where I'm from. And I woke up and I was like, nope, I can get home. So I drove back to Mum and Dad's, crashed early. The next morning, I literally rang Mum and Dad from my bedroom and I was like, I physically cannot get out of bed. And my health for the next 4 weeks after that moment just drastically declined. I lost 10 kilos, and I'm 6 foot. I didn't have 10 kilos to lose. I'd gone to the other spectrum and had severe diarrhea. I was so depleted that I physically couldn't get up off the couch to walk to the toilet. Like my dad had to carry me and, wait outside the door until I was ready to be carried back. Like it was horrible. And we started going and seeing all these doctors. I'm in the country. Unfortunately, I didn't have specialists and all of that to go and see. So it was a bit trying to get a diagnosis. And I got so physically sick that my now husband, boyfriend at the time, he had to come up as well. And between him, Mum and Dad, they all took time off work. And I was on 24-hour supervision. And my diagnosis went from stomach cancer to just anxiety, I think it was. Like the diagnosis was very broad. And eventually I got into a specialist and they checked my thyroid and diagnosed me with Hashimotos. And it's really interesting because now Hashimotos is, as I mentioned, the main thyroid condition. But back then, 13 years ago, it really wasn't a condition that was talked about. It's still a very misunderstood condition, and the thyroid is still very misunderstood, especially in the Western world. I feel like naturopaths have, particularly when they specialize in this area, just have such a amazing understanding of the thyroid and how you can manage it without medication. So once I got my diagnosis, my husband and I were heading over to India and we were riding a motorbike down the coastline for 6 weeks. And I was so sick and I was advised obviously not to go, but I was determined. And I left the doctors with a bag, no joke, full of pills. And he was like, you were to take one of these every day for the rest of your life to help manage your thyroid. And I believe in time and place for medication. However, I knew there was so much wiggle room and I knew I'd not been living a great lifestyle. And so when I went to India, I dove into a vegan lifestyle and started using all their herbs and spices. And I really just went on this beautiful healing journey when I was over there and continued that when I got back. And that's what led me into naturopathy and now doing other people. So that was a long answer, but yeah, that was how I was diagnosed and when I was diagnosed. And to this day, I've managed my condition unmedicated, which still in the Western world, it's their only approach is medication. But in the naturopathic world, we know that there's another way, and we know that yes, there's a time and a place for medication, but the thyroid can actually be managed beautifully. Diet and the right supplements.
So I'm assuming there just needs to be more research to back all this up.
Well, there is the research there. There is a
right.
lot of research now around the thyroid, not specifically through pregnancy, but with thyroid health, there's lots of research. It's just not being looked at,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So we're looking at it, us naturopaths.
Okay. Do you mind if we take a few steps back? So there's a few questions, like from my small amount of knowledge, I know that this is an autoimmune disease. I know that women are more likely to have this issue. And is it correct that a lot of thyroid issues do become prevalent during pregnancy?
Correct. So, yeah, so all of those things are correct. It's definitely seen more in females than males. I like to say with the thyroid, and we'll talk about some thyroid testings, which will also make more sense with this, but it can be the thyroid itself. There's different triggers, I guess, for it. And the reason that it becomes more prevalent through pregnancy or postpartum is that hormone fluctuation. So one of the triggers is hormones. So often women may experience it through pregnancy and or postpartum, and menopause is another time in a woman's life when it may come out. The other triggers are nutrient depletions and also stress is a big one. And then environmental triggers, which I don't see so much the environmental triggers, but the stress, nutrient depletions, and the hormone fluctuations, absolutely. So basically the thyroid can be bubbling away under the surface. So if we think about testings, and this is the way that a woman would get her diagnosis, is through blood pathology. So do you want to jump into blood pathology?
Well, before we do, because I would like to discuss testing.
Yep.
But can we just go through a little bit first about before a woman even considers testing? Let's say we've got a pregnant woman listening today who's feeling a bit fatigued and, things might be a bit off. Let's first discuss the symptoms and what might alert someone to the fact that, hey, maybe I should actually go and see my doctor or go get tested for this.
Yeah, for sure. So I find in pregnancy, the thyroid during pregnancy and postpartum, I find it will kind of balance out in one but flare in the other. So for example, I've had 3 pregnancies. My thyroid balanced in pregnancy, so I had no symptoms, no issues with my thyroid, but it flared postpartum. So the symptoms a woman can experience could be in either pregnancy or postpartum. And as I mentioned, it's the weight fluctuations. So either extreme weight gain or loss, or just having trouble. Say she's in her postpartum and she's just having trouble moving extra weight. And obviously it's not all weight focused, but women know their own body. And, some women will come to me and they're like, I feel like I'm eating pretty well and I'm starting to move now. And they're down the, 6+ months on, and they're like, I still just have all this stubborn weight, for example. Fatigue is absolutely one of the biggest symptoms, and especially that extreme fatigue that makes you feel nauseous, which a lot of women experience in pregnancy as well and postpartum, even if they don't have thyroid issues. Sensitive to cold or very sensitive to heat, depending on which way your thyroid is, but more commonly sensitive to cold. So really cold fingers all the time, really cold feet. The other symptoms, I mentioned the constipation, so gut issues often come hand in hand. Some women will experience like joint pain as well. What other symptoms? They're probably the most common symptoms. And as you can hear, all those symptoms kind of can get bundled up into pregnancy and or postpartum. And so this is where the thyroid is commonly missed as being an issue in pregnancy or postpartum, because the symptoms are often just put down to, well, you're pregnant or you've just had a baby or you're still 6 months postpartum. So that's where the thyroid's getting missed. And just because you have those symptoms also doesn't mean that you are going to have a thyroid issue, because as we know, they kind of go hand in hand with pregnancy and postpartum too. But it's a confusing kind of time for a woman. Yeah.
Which is why it's so good that we can be aware of it, because I think people are their own best advocates, health advocates, just like with our kids as they go through childcare and school. And often we are their best advocates at this stage to help them receive the care they need. And for ourselves as well, we are our own best advocates. So if we don't know what we don't know, so if we are aware of these things, then we can advocate for further information to see if this issue is related to us. Now, before we go on to testing, have we been bundling up thyroid issues all under the one umbrella? And what type of thyroid issues are there? Because I know like there's Hashimoto's, there's underactive, overactive. Like what?
Yeah.
What are we talking about?
So they're not all bundled up. That's one thing. Once you've started investigating the thyroid, your blood pathology will tell you whether you're underactive or overactive. Hashimoto's is definitely the most common. I think one thing that is very misunderstood is postpartum thyroiditis, which again is linked back to this pregnancy postpartum issue. So just because it's called postpartum thyroiditis doesn't necessarily mean you weren't experiencing it through pregnancy as well. So postpartum thyroiditis often gets missed or does get bundled up into this Hashimoto's picture. So postpartum thyroiditis essentially is hormonal driven and it resolves within a year postpartum. It doesn't mean, though, that you have to deal with the symptoms for that year, because the symptoms can be quite extreme. And going back to you saying we're our own best advocate, I see women time and time again continuing to explore their thyroid just because the symptoms they're feeling just still don't feel right, particularly in that postpartum pregnancies. Like they might be tired, but they know that extreme fatigue is a different kind of fatigue. And they're like, hang on, this just doesn't feel right. So I think definitely tuning in is really important. But yeah, postpartum thyroiditis generally resolves within the first year of postpartum, and that's when the hormones are settling down. Whereas Hashimoto's is a lifelong condition that can be managed and not always in a flare, I like to say. So it's does that answer that question?
Yeah. And whether or not you have underactive or overactive, are they similar symptoms that you might be experiencing?
Opposite. So
opposite symptoms. Okay.
Yeah. So you know how I said it can be weight
there goes my ignorance.
No. You know how it's like it could be weight gain or
weight loss.
Or weight loss. Yeah.
Okay, right.
Which way you're going. And then the other thing with the thyroid is often your thyroid will start in the hyperthyroid, so the overactive state, which is Graves' disease. So generally with Graves' disease, it's the weight loss. It is more sensitive to heat. It's a really fast heart rate. It's those kind of symptoms. And like obviously with the weight loss, it's that fast digestive, so often diarrhea. Whereas Hashimoto's is the underactive, so the hypothyroid picture, which is the opposite. So it's the slowness. So it's the weight gain. It's the slow digestive system and the constipation. So it's that slowed heart rate. It's slowness as opposed to the fastness. And the thyroid initially, I actually had a client the other day who's pregnant, and her thyroid, we've been testing it every 4 weeks because she's swinging at the moment between her and hypo. And that commonly happens. And it can happen for a couple of months, even like up to 6 months for some people. And then eventually, more often than not, your thyroid will swing into the hypo, which is Hashimoto's, and that's where you'll land in the slowness. Graves is a very small percent of women. Hashimoto's is the main thyroid condition. I'm not 100% sure the stats around what it is, but yeah.
You're right. And because I know Hashimoto's is for life, is that right? It's a long-term issue.
Right.
If you develop issues with pregnancy, what do you know roughly what percentage of them are just through pregnancy and postpartum, and then what percentage end up being longer term?
No, I don't know the exact percent, but the way we understand whether this is a pregnancy, postpartum thyroiditis or Hashimoto's is through your testing and your antibodies. So if you're happy to jump into testing,
let's do it. Take it away.
So when we go to the GP and you're like, look, I've got all these symptoms, it could be postpartum or pregnancy, it might not be, can we test the thyroid? Often what they test is your TSH, which is not actually a thyroid. So it's not your thyroid hormones that they're testing. It's the way your brain communicates with your thyroid to release thyroid hormones. So your TSH doesn't actually give us a true understanding of what's happening with your thyroid. But what will happen is your TSH will be tested. If that comes back in the abnormal range, and for a GP, again, the Western reference ranges are very broad and very different to what we're looking at from a naturopathic point of view, especially during pregnancy or postpartum. And generally speaking, your TSH should sit outside of pregnancy 1 to 2. During pregnancy, we normally see it sit sort of 2 to 3, because up until about 18, 20 weeks, baby is solely relying on your thyroid. So it is very natural for your thyroid to be working harder during that first half of pregnancy, essentially. So your TSH will sit somewhere between 2 and 3. A GP's reference range for the thyroid in general, whether you're a 50-year-old male or a pregnant woman or non-pregnant, is 0.5 to 4.5. So it is a very broad reference range. So unless that comes back abnormal, then what a GP will do is test your T3, T4. Sometimes if you've got a great GP who's really understanding, they might also do a T4 reading. Your T4 is thyroxine. So your T3, T4 are your actual thyroid hormones and how those are being released into your body. And if we think about the thyroid literally controls most things in our body. And as you've heard me talk about the symptoms, it controls our metabolism, our temperature regulation, it controls our energy. Like a thyroid is our powerhouse, right? And so your T3, T4 are your thyroid hormones. And when they're released into the body, we get an understanding as to how your thyroid is actually functioning. So that's your 3 measurements: TSH, how your brain communicates with your thyroid; your T3, your T4 are your thyroid hormones. We really need to be looking at the whole picture to actually understand what your thyroid is doing. And if you suspect a thyroid issue and you're not having any luck with your GP, you can look up iscreen.com.au. And iScreen, you can request your own thyroid testing, blood pathology tests, and you get it sent to your email and you take it to your blood pathology and you can kind of go around the GP. And I think from memory, it's about $120 out of pocket. Now, the other test that is really important are your thyroid antibodies. So thyroid antibodies are often not tested at all. And your thyroid antibodies essentially are what tell us whether this is a lifelong condition such as Hashimotos or if this is postpartum thyroiditis. If you have thyroid antibodies present, and a small amount of thyroid antibodies is normal, say under 30 is quite common, most people will have some antibodies present, but anything higher than that means that there is an autoimmune picture playing out. Now, your thyroid antibodies can be bubbling under the surface for up to 10 years before your TSH, T3, and T4 become reflective of that on a blood pathology. So you may have been experiencing sluggish digestion, weight problems, and fatigue, for example, for years and years and years, had your TSH, T3, T4 tested, keep getting told your thyroid's fine, but these antibodies are here bubbling under the surface, and the higher they get, the more it pushes you into an autoimmune condition. Whereas if they're addressed early enough, we can actually reverse that even happening, which is really sad, right? That it gets to this point. And thyroid antibodies just aren't tested unless you ask for them to be tested. And even then you might get a little bit of pushback, a lot of pushback actually. But through iScreen, you can test your thyroid antibodies. Now, if your thyroid antibodies come back low or non-existent, and your TSH, T4, T3 are still out of whack and you're in that postpartum period. I've even seen it with miscarriage. Still, obviously, you're still in that postpartum after a miscarriage. So even that can throw out your thyroid as well. If those antibodies aren't there, but the thyroid, TSH, T3, T4 are out of whack. So say your TSH is really high normally, often your T4 is quite low and your T3 might be normal or a little bit high. That means it's more of this postpartum thyroiditis picture playing out, and it will most likely resolve itself within a year. However, as I mentioned, there's still lots you can do to still reverse those symptoms and not just have to put up with them. Because with postpartum thyroiditis, you might get offered medication and just told to wait it out. Does that make sense for testing?
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And it's so great to know that if you do pick this up early, it can be really helpful.
Yeah, and that's a common misconception is that thyroid antibodies, if it's Hashimoto's, can't be reversed. It can. It just always needs to be managed, because you will most likely go through flare-ups again through certain points of your life. For example, if you have a lot of stress present, or if you go through a pregnancy or postpartum or menopause, these are all times in your life where you'd be keeping an eye on your thyroid to see what your thyroid antibodies are doing. And if they start to creep up, that's when you know you need to put some interventions in place to bring them back down. The common misconception with Hashimoto's not being reversed or controlled through diet and supplementation alone lies within thyroxine being one of the only, or medication such as thyroxine being the only thing that's offered in the Western world. Thyroxine is your T4 hormone. So when we take thyroxine, essentially you are releasing more T4, but that doesn't, when you release more T4, that can balance out your TSH and T3. However, it often doesn't address your antibodies at all. And as long as those antibodies are present, you will always have a thyroid issue. So my goal when somebody comes to me is, okay, we need to look at where your antibodies are, and let's first establish whether this is Hashimoto's picture. I can't diagnose, but I can help you get a diagnosis, or if this is a postpartum pregnancy flare. And then from there, we can kind of put that plan together as to what it looks like in bringing those antibodies down. And I had a client yesterday who went and saw, she had recurrent miscarriage, and she has an endocrinologist, and they'd missed Hashimoto's because her antibodies hadn't been tested until we started working together. They got tested. They were through the roof. They were at 1,400, which is so, so high. Thyroid antibodies present can cause miscarriage. She's had 3 miscarriages. It still hasn't been investigated. And I said to her, we have to test your antibodies, because I believe they are what's impacting your fertility in this journey. And she then got referred to an endocrinologist and a recurrent miscarriage clinic. And both of those, she said, I'm working with a naturopath. She told me to get the antibodies tested, and they said, the recurrent miscarriage facility said, yeah, look, we think that is probably what has been causing your miscarriage, but there's nothing we can do. And her endocrinologist said the same thing. There's nothing we can do for your antibodies. And she said, oh, my naturopath said that we can bring them down through and we'll talk about all this, but gluten-free diet and some supplements. And they're like, what? We've never heard of that. And the research is there. I looked it all up again last night to send to her so that she had information, because information's power. And within a month, we've managed to get her antibodies down by 150. So the proof is in the pudding with your blood pathology. Thyroid antibodies can be decreased. It's just in the Western world, unfortunately, they're not looking at the latest research for whatever reason. And it's
Shelley, time for you to get to a few medical conferences. Guest speaker.
You're right.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, well, let's go into that then. Let's go into a few of the treatment options.
Yeah, so number 1 is gluten-free. So gluten-free is not only very inflammatory for the body, but it also directly attacks the thyroid. So as long as there is gluten in the diet, it's going to be very hard for the thyroid to find its balance and to heal itself. So going gluten-free can be really overwhelming for some. And, I always just say, do it one day at a time. It doesn't need to be a big shift straight away. Going gluten-free is more for long-term thyroid health. If it's Hashimoto's, I say gluten-free for life, ideally, even when you're not in a flare. Myself, I've been gluten-free since my diagnosis, but it took me 2 years to fully be gluten-free, just because there wasn't as many options, 13, 14 years ago. But nowadays it's pretty easy. It's just being really conscious and looking at all your labels and things like that. So even the other day, I had a client send me a picture of tamari, which is often the gluten-free soy sauce alternative. And now all of a sudden they've started adding gluten to it, which is meant to be the gluten-free soy sauce alternative. So it's just like looking at your packaging, looking at your sauces, thinking outside of the box of where you think gluten would normally be, like your normal breads and pastas, and going for the alternative. So gluten-free is a really great step forward. If that's even the only thing you do, it will still make an impact to your thyroid antibodies. In terms
out of interest, is your whole family gluten-free? And how much do you feed your children gluten?
Yeah, they're not. So with us and the way we do it, so I have three toddlers for anyone listening. My husband still eats a little bit of gluten. In terms of our cooking, it's all gluten-free, what we cook and bake. But for example, my kids will have some sourdough. So, on a weekend, my husband might be doing breakfast and they'll have sourdough. If I'm in a rush and it's toast, they'll have sourdough bread. Audrey, just knowing that it is more prevalent in females, Audrey, I do often give the gluten-free option, but I keep a little bit in her diet just because I'm also very conscious with little kids. One day their diet is out of my control when they start going to like birthdays and all of that. Like my kids hover around the lolly and cake table. So I want them to be able to have gluten without any other severe reaction. But Audrey, I do try to keep more on a gluten-free, like her bread would be gluten-free. But any pastas and stuff like that would always be gluten-free in our house. We just keep small amounts in there.
Because I often think my kids have too much gluten, probably wheat-based products. And as we speak, I'm Googling gluten-free kids recipes.
Yeah, look, it's more like the alternative.
Just to mix it up.
Yeah, and it's so rice is gluten-free. Oats is a really common, so oats is gluten-free. And so I still eat just normal oats. I don't do the gluten-free oats, but it's the protein within oats that can sometimes mimic gluten. Okay. But I personally still eat oats because I think you also need to look at your inflammation markers, which on a blood pathology is called a CRP. If you have really high inflammation markers, then going gluten-free is going, like all gluten-free, even oats is going to be really beneficial. But if you've still got low CRP markers, oats are still fine to have in. As I mentioned, rice is fine. It's more just like, so say pastas, we just do the San Remo gluten-free pasta as opposed to the normal, or you can get the really good Simply Wise is the brand, like the gnocchi. They do like sweet potato gnocchi and stuff like that. Like my kids love that stuff. Or like even all your Mexican dishes, they're still all gluten-free, like your corn tortillas and all that gluten-free. So like you still can get lots of really good kid-friendly, meals in there. The bread's pretty rubbish though for gluten-free. So
is that why you'd go sourdough if you do have bread, your kids?
Yeah, my kids, I still do the good quality sourdough because it is like if it's being cooked the right way and had that, long fermentation process, like sourdough is beautiful to have in the diet. But I do gluten-free bread. So the bread I use is gluten-free Precint and I still have gluten-free bread. But then within saying that, like we often do like a Greek night where the kids will have like pitta or, we have pizza and the kids will still eat normal. I eat gluten-free though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's a really good step forward. And dairy is another one that is commonly taken out of the diet, but I just don't believe in removing too much from the diet because it's already sucky enough for a lot of people having to go gluten-free. So we've got to keep some joy in there. So dairy, again, I don't pull out unless the inflammation marker, the CRP is really high, or if obviously there's an intolerance, but it wouldn't be a long-term thing like gluten-free with the dairy. So say we did pull out the dairy because of inflammation markers, hopefully it would only be a few months until we had those inflammation markers down.
And is it true, and I actually don't know this, but I've heard that it's often not dairy that people are intolerant to, it's lactose.
Correct.
And I know this will be different for everyone, but it's very easy to substitute lactose-free yogurts and milks, and that's not really...
Oh. Yeah, absolutely. And even like all your coconut products and stuff like we don't have heaps of dairy in our house, I've got to admit. Like the kids will have coconut yogurt and Yeah, and if there's ever a recipe with like milk and stuff, we normally use like coconut milk, or so we don't have heaps of dairy, but there is lots of alternatives out there. They might have a little bit of
Mm.
cheese, my kids, but yeah, you don't have to go dairy free.
So no cereal in your house?
No, and it's so funny because when we started at Kinder, they were one day the kids went there and they're like, "Oh my God, your kids love brekkie." And I said, "Oh, what's on the menu for brekkie?" And they said, and they eat brekkie at home, by the way, before I drop them, but then they have a second brekkie. And I said, "Oh, what do you do for brekkie?" And they said, "Cereal." And I said, "Oh, yeah, they would love it. They've never had it before." And they were like, "What do you mean your kids have never had cereal?" And I was like,
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's like, what do you feed them?
"Oh, yeah, it is just so, I don't know. It's just not a part of our, which, yeah, it's just
What
not
do
a
they have
part."
for breakfast? Just out
They
of
have
interest?
oats. Yep. So
Oh, oats. Okay.
they'll have oats, which, yeah, they'll have a form of porridge with like all the seeds and like all the flax meal, chia seeds, protein powder, coconut yogurt and berries is normally one option, or they have egg on sourdough or just omelets. Yeah.
An omelette not on toast?
Not always, depends. Sometimes they will. Sometimes I
Okay.
do it on like a gluten-free muffin if they want a little muffin, but they'll do an omelette. And in that omelette, I might put avocado, bacon, cheese. Like I try to kind of boost up what's in the omelette. Yeah.
Oh
So
my
that's,
God. I don't want to tell you what I give my kids.
we need to do
really
a nutrition episode.
no, God. It's so hard. And as they're getting older, it's getting even harder because they're getting more opinionated about what they do want and what they don't want. Anyway, that's a whole other topic and I won't.
It is. And remember, I'm a
discuss it.
nutritionist, right? Like I was a nutritionist before having kids as well. So this is kind of just like my kids eat what I eat, essentially, because I'm not making separate stuff. And if they don't want to eat what I eat, then they don't eat. Like I'm very cutthroat with that. Like I'm very like, this is what's for dinner. And if you don't eat it, I'm sorry, but that's what we're having. And as a result, I think I have really good eaters. But yeah, I don't know. I'm a nutritionist though. So, you know, cereal, like there's time and a place. Like, and you can get like Cheerios, right? They're actually a really good cereal alternative. I just say try to like, yeah, Cheerios, believe it or
Are
not.
they? What?
Yeah,
Are
low
they
in
really high in sugar?
No, they're low in sugar. Mm.
What are they? How do they get sweet then? It's so sweet.
Let me have a look at their sugar, because what you want to do is 15 grams or less per 100 grams. We're sort of digressing now.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. We're just having a little mini consult here. What do I feed my kids for breakfast?
But I just say if like cereal is what they're doing, try to at least add like a protein powder into the milk, or, you know, like try to boost that. You might put peanut butter drizzled over the top so they're getting in a good fat. So yeah, per 100 grams, hang on, let me look at the 100 grams. It's like 4.4%. No, sorry, 14 grams of sugar per 100 grams. And you're wanting 15 grams or less. So, you know, like, yeah, you can get.
God, I would have just thought that's like all just refined. There you go.
Yeah,
I had no idea.
You can definitely get better options. That wouldn't be my first point. But like if your kid's having like Cocoa Pops or like those kind of cereal, like Sultana grain and stuff, like I think Cheerios actually has less sugar than those.
Okay, what about just Wheat Bix or Vitabix?
Wheat Bix, good.
Okay, phew, right, okay.
Wheat Bix is a great option. Yeah.
Okay, just very high in wheat.
It is. But again, like don't focus too much on the gluten unless you need to.
Yeah.
Right. And you can also get gluten-free Wheat Bix if you wanted to reduce the wheat. But I would be more trying to balance that meal with, like, as I said, adding like a protein powder, like the Nutri-Organics is a family-friendly one, adding that to the milk.
Yeah.
And like, you know, making sure they're getting that protein in, or the fat drizzled over the top, or, you know, those kind of things.
Okay. Hot tips. Thank you, Shelley. Right. Back to thyroid issues and pregnancy. Anything else we haven't talked about?
Just quickly, your supplements. So supplements go a long way, and normally within 3 months we see a really big shift within your thyroid when using supplements, particularly with your antibodies. And the supplements that you'd be looking at is a myo-inositol, which is beautiful. It also stabilizing blood sugar, which also, if weight has been a problem, can help with those kind of underlying symptoms as well. With myo-inositol, synergistically, selenium works really well with myo-inositol. So I normally do those two as a combination. Sometimes we can bring in a thyroid multi if there's nutrient depletions at play. So again, I mentioned the nutrient depletions just quickly. Like when you're getting your blood pathology, we really want to be looking at the nutrient cofactors that support your thyroid, which are iron, vitamin D, your folate, your B12. Those nutrients are really important for thyroid health. And if you're, say, really iron deficient, particularly through pregnancy, not uncommon, postpartum, not uncommon to be flatlined unless maybe you've managed to keep it up or had an infusion, that could also be triggering your thyroid, whether that is Hashimoto's or the postpartum thyroiditis picture. So really important to also be looking at the nutrients as well as the thyroid TSH, T3, T4 antibodies when you're doing your blood pathology. But I think that probably sums up most of it.
Amazing. Well, that is a big topic that we've squeezed into 45 minutes.
Okay.
So thank you. Amazing.
And sorry if I digressed anywhere in there. It is a huge topic that we could talk about for ages, but I hope that has given your listeners some, guidance. And as you said, like, just keep advocating for yourself. If it doesn't feel right, something's not right. And I think particularly if you're trying to navigate this in the postpartum pregnancy period, it more so comes out in postpartum, but just know that your symptoms don't have to be normal. And yes, just because you had a baby doesn't mean that you should feel crappy all the time or feel exhausted every day, or you can actually feel well and function well. Of course, you're going to have your up and down days in the newborn, toddler life, but you don't have to feel like that. So it's worth investigating it if you feel like you're struggling in any way.
Yeah, and that's a perfect way to end this podcast episode. Thank you, Shelley. How can anyone who's listened to you today, how can they come and find you?
Yep, I'm active on Instagram. It's just Shelley McKenzie _Natropath, or you can look me up at freedomwellness.com.au and find me there.
Beautiful. And I'll put all those links in the show notes. Thank you for joining me today, Shelley. It was great.
It's been great. Thanks for having me. Bye, guys.
Catch you soon. Bye. That's it, ladies. Before I sign off, remember my team and I will be putting together the show notes for this episode with all the links, including how to connect with Shelley at fitnessmama.com/podcast. Have a fabulous day, and I look forward to you joining me next week for another episode of the Pregnancy, Birth and Recovery podcast. Thanks for listening to the Fitness Mama podcast, brought to you by the Fitness Mama freebies found at www.fitnessmama.com/free. So please take a few seconds to leave a review, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and be sure to take a screenshot of this podcast, upload it to your social media, and tag me at Fitness Mama so I can give you a shout out too. Until next time, remember, an active pregnancy, confident childbirth, and strong postnatal recovery is something that you deserve. Remember our disclaimer: materials and contents in this podcast are intended as general information only and shouldn't substitute any medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I'll see you soon.